Well, hey, good morning, everybody. I'm Pete. Glad to be with you guys this morning. Hey, I don't know if you guys have seen this show or have ever watched shows on Netflix. I'm sure you have. There's a show on Netflix right now called Love is Blind. It started a couple years ago, and my wife and I decided to watch this. It's such an interesting show because the way that people meet each other in this show, it looks a lot like this. So this is like an aerial view, and the guys come in on this side and the girls come in on that side. There's a whole bunch of people mixing it up in these different pods. But the only way that they get to know each other is with this big wall between them. They never get to see each other. So the conversations that they have are the only way that they get to know each other. And it's kind of like this love experiment to find out, can you actually fall in love with somebody without actually seeing them? And then what's crazy, I mean, this is actually a really crazy part of this show. It's super entertaining to watch, but I can't imagine what it would be like in real life. In the course of like 10 days, they have to decide whether or not, based on seeing each other, they decide to propose and move on in their relationship. Because the only way their relationship can move forward is if somebody gets down on one knee and proposes to them. So it sets up for this crazy expectation that the person that I've gotten to know is going to match the person that I see. And so it's super entertaining when somebody proposes and then the curtains open up and they get to see each other. And sometimes it's like, they're like, all right, let's keep going. And other times they're like, I gotta go. I got something else to do now. But it's kind of interesting to realize when reality meets expectation, there's change that actually has to happen. And maybe you've had this in your life before where you had an expectation of how something was gonna go, but in reality, when expectation met reality, reality was a little different than what you were hoping for. For instance, suppose one time your friend said, hey, I got a new car, and you were expecting their new car to look like this. You're thinking, well, that's going to be awesome. He's driving up in his new car. But then when they actually drive up in their car, it's this. And you're thinking to yourself, that's not what I expected, but he's like, hey, it's new to me, so, it's new. Or maybe sometime you were thinking to yourself, I'm gonna go over to this person's house, and the food's going to be great, and you're expecting yourself to be happy. You got this food all over you, right? But in reality, you taste the food, and this is what you actually feel like. Or maybe you have booked a vacation before and you're imagining that the vacation destination is going to be like this. You're sitting on the beach. It's going to be beautiful. The breeze is in your hair. And then when you show up to the vacation destination, it actually looks like this. Some stanky old hotel with an air conditioner that's falling apart. You've probably been there before. I know I have, when it wasn't quite what I was expecting. Or maybe you've gone to a Christmas party thinking that it was an ugly sweater Christmas party. And when you showed up, you're the only one wearing an ugly sweater. Or with Thanksgiving around the corner, maybe you have thought to yourself, hey, when we get to Thanksgiving, it's just going to be us and the family. And then you walk through the door and there's so many more people that you don't know. All of us have been there sometime, somewhere, in some way, where expectations met reality and it just wasn't exactly what you were hoping that it was going to be. Maybe let's take it a little bit more tense and think about it like this way. Maybe you got engaged to someone. And you had high expectations. And after you got married, you're in it for a year, and maybe you're in it for now 10 years, a couple of years, and you think to yourself, did I make a mistake? This just isn't what I expected. And you never expected that it would come to divorce. And maybe you got a new job, and you thought to yourself, I'm going to change the world. And you never imagined that you'd be counting the seconds till the end of your shift, just waiting to go home. And you never imagined or expected that you'd be sliding a resignation letter across your boss's desk. Maybe you bought your dream home and you never imagined that it was going to be the nightmare of work that it actually is. And you never expected that you'd be checking Zillow already looking for more options. Because no matter who you are, if you're wealthy or you're poor, if you're young or if you're old, everyone has had expectations that eventually come into contact with reality. And maybe you came into church today with some expectations. When you walk through the store. I mean, all of us have. Nobody comes in here without some preconceived notions or some expectations. Maybe you came in here with expectations of how long the service was going to be. We say it's going to be 60 minutes, so you're coming with an expectation. You're having an expectation of how the music might sound. You're having an expectation of how good-looking the preacher might be. And I have to apologize, the good-looking preacher preaches next week. But you've had expectations about God, too, when you came in here today. You have an expectation of how disappointed he might be in you or how proud he might be of you. You have an expectation of how close he is, whether that's distant or far. You might have an expectation of how kind he is or maybe how angry he is with you. Because we hear people talk and we hear Scripture speak, and so eventually we develop expectations, and we brought them with us today. Whether or not you intended to, we all walked through the doors with our own expectations. So the person we're going to talk about today is a guy by the name of Zacchaeus. Now, if you've been in church for a long time, you maybe have heard the story of Zacchaeus before. But Zacchaeus is interesting because he was about to see Jesus for the very first time. And his only expectation was that he was going to see Jesus. That was what he was planning on. That's what he was looking forward to that day. So we're going to jump into the text and see what happens when expectation meets reality. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was because he was short and he could not see over the crowd. I think this is interesting because we learn a couple things as we get to know who Zacchaeus is. And as we're meeting here this day, we learn a couple things. Number one, he's a tax collector. So you got to know when we read that into the text that we're reading today, the context was nobody liked the tax collector. And let's just be honest, 2,000 years later, we still don't. Sorry if you're a tax collector in the room, but nobody likes paying taxes. It just is what it is. So he also wanted to see Jesus. So he really wanted to see Jesus badly. I love that it says in the text that he was short and he couldn't see over the crowd. So that's the other thing that we learn about him is that he's abnormally small. And maybe you've struggled with that in your life. I know I have. Got all the short jokes forever. But he was short, and he was shorter than most other people. Now, I got to say, if you're a church person, then maybe you have expectations of where this story is going. In fact, right now, when you hear the name Zacchaeus, you probably already have a song playing in your head that you learned when you were in Sunday school, right? So we have to kind of take all those expectations that we have about the story of Zacchaeus and kind of throw them away. And let's pretend that we've never heard this story before. All we know about Zacchaeus is that he's a short tax collector. This is what the story tells us, right? Short tax collector. So let's just jump into the rest of it. It says, he ran ahead and he climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. Now, I think this is interesting, too, because he ran ahead and he climbed a tree. Now, if you were a kid, then that might be a normal thing for you to do. I'm sure that some of you, when you were younger, probably liked to climb trees. I know I did. I was a risk taker for a long time in my life. I would climb trees as high as I possibly could. Some of you might have done that as well, all the way up to the time you're maybe in your 20s. But then when you get past that, you think, I'm not climbing that tree because if I fall, I'm going to break my face. So we just don't do that anymore. So it's not really a recreational activity of an adult. So for him, he's coming to an admission, right? He's saying, I'm short, I can't see, so I have to climb in order to see. And that would have been humiliating because he literally couldn't see over the crowd. So he humbled himself to climb a tree so that he could see because Jesus was coming that way. That's just such an interesting thing that we learn a little bit about him. And I think it tells us a little bit about Zacchaeus, that maybe we shouldn't judge a book by its cover. The crowd that day was judging a book by its cover. It's why our mom always tells us, don't judge a book by a cover. Maybe there's more to the person than what we can see. And if he's so passionate about climbing the tree to see Jesus, maybe there's more to him than what we would even expect. Okay, then it says, Jesus reached the spot, and he looked up to him, and he said, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. A couple observations I have here is that all of a sudden this story shifts. And it's no longer from Zacchaeus' perspective and what he's doing. All of a sudden now we see Jesus is in the midst of the story. And I think this is really a beautiful thing. Zacchaeus' expectation were to see Jesus, right? So Zacchaeus, while he was going to see if he could look at Jesus, Jesus was searching for him. Isn't that crazy? While he's going to look for Jesus, Jesus was already searching for him. And it's also kind of a strange thing, because while Jesus was searching for him, he had some advantage here. He knew his name, Zacchaeus, and he also knew that he had a house, so he knew details about Zacchaeus. He knew who Zacchaeus was. Zacchaeus clearly didn't know him because he had to climb a tree to even see him, right? He had no idea what he looked like. And it's not like today when you can just like Facebook stalk somebody and find out what they look like and know about all their details about their life. You couldn't do that without the internet or electricity, right? So he knew his name and he knew he had a house. And I just think, that must have been a strange experience for someone that was trying to see Jesus for the first time. I wonder how would you react when all of a sudden your expectations met reality. He didn't know him, but Jesus knew him. It's kind of crazy. I'm not sure if my reaction might have been to like run and hide because this stranger knows me. But let's see how he reacted. He came down at once and welcomed him gladly. He jumped out of the tree, and with a response, he said, gladly, like he was happy to see him. His response was like maybe not what I would have responded as. But it's also interesting. So like there's another third member to this story. First we see Zacchaeus' desires. We see his height. We see all this stuff. We see like that everybody perceives him as a tax collector. And then we see Jesus jump into the story who has some knowledge about who Zacchaeus is. But now we have a third introduction into the story because the crowd is part of the story as well. And oftentimes when we see the crowd in these stories, in this ancient text, the Israelite crowd was often very judgmental. And so we see what their expectations were for the Messiah. They weren't expecting him to be what Jesus was. And so their response to Jesus' behavior was interesting as well. Here's what happened. All the people saw this and began to mutter, "He's gone to be at the house of a sinner." They began to mutter. See, they weren't expecting Jesus to hang out with somebody like Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus had a reputation. Zacchaeus was a tax collector. Nobody liked him. And they particularly didn't like the fact that tax collectors had the reputation of stealing. And so they were upset. Why would Jesus hang out with a sinner? And so because of that, the muttering began. They started to talk. And they started to say, "I can't believe that he's hanging out at Zacchaeus' house. That's not what I would want him to do. Does he not know how bad Zacchaeus is? Does he not know what a sinner Zacchaeus is? Like, how does Jesus not know? I would not expect the Messiah to go hang there." In fact, a priest, like priests in the crowd might have said that day, in order to be interacting with God, I have to ceremonially cleanse myself from sin. How is it that Messiah, this God figure, could be hanging out with a sinner? It doesn't make any sense. But do you think that muttering has ever happened for us in a church setting? Have you ever muttered in a setting like this? I mean, suppose you came in one time and, we're having communion and you got handed these little cups, and as you're trying to struggle to open it, you're like, "I didn't expect this little wafer. I expect fresh bread when I come here for communion." Or maybe in another sense, someone walked through the doors and you saw them walk in and you thought to yourself, "I work with this person. I know what they behave like outside of church." And so the muttering began, "They shouldn't even be here. They don't belong here. They're a hypocrite for showing up here today." And maybe you've said or felt feelings like that. Quite possibly, though, you've been on the other side of that. When you walked in here and you felt the tension and you felt to yourself, "I feel like I don't belong here because I'm not good enough to be here." The muttering happens among Christian circles sometimes, and it can shape, or maybe change, the reality of what we're even doing here at church. But what happens next, in my opinion, really should be something that should shift our reality. Because what happens next in the story gives us a clear perspective of why Jesus is here. And if we have perspective of why he's here, it should impact the way that we live. So let's continue the story. Zacchaeus stood up and he said to the Lord, Look, Lord, here and now I give half my possessions to the poor. And if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." His response to Jesus showing up, his reaction to the reality that Jesus knew him, was kind of crazy. In fact, nobody in the crowd that day would have expected a sinful person to respond that way. But somehow in the interaction with Jesus, Zacchaeus is impacted. And he lowers himself. He responds. His reaction to the reality of Jesus is humility. It's brokenness. It's sacrifice. So Jesus has a response too. This is what Jesus says next. "Today, salvation has come to this house because this man too is a son of Abraham." I just think this is crazy. We're talking about one statement here that instantaneously Jesus said, "Today salvation has come." Today salvation has come. I mean, what was it about Zacchaeus' reaction that instantaneously Jesus offered salvation to him? And what was it that did Zacchaeus impress him? Because he clearly didn't have time to get right with God. There was no time for him to straighten anything out. So why did Jesus respond that way? For me, this reminds me of another story that maybe is familiar to you. The story that we talk about Jesus when he was hanging on the cross. He was hanging there with 2 other people. And they were both on a cross. And they deserved to be there while Jesus didn't. But 2 of them were both thieves being hung on a cross as their punishment. And one of them was hurling insults at Jesus. And as they hurled insults, they said to Jesus, this man said to Jesus, if you're the Messiah, why can't you just pull us down off of the cross? And the other thief kind of steps in, and he's like, listen, no. You shouldn't talk to him that way. And look at what the thief says to Jesus. He said, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Again, go back to that other slide real quick. Again, this is just a thief responding to the fact that he's hanging out with Jesus there on the cross. They're both about to die. And so in one statement, he says this to him. And now look at Jesus' response. You can go to the next one now. Jesus answered him, truly I tell you, today, he uses the same word, today you will be with me in paradise. Today. An instantaneous response. That just in that moment, Jesus says, salvation is yours. Salvation, immediately. Now, when you go back to this like Zacchaeus comment, and look at this, he says in this, today salvation has come to your house because this man too is a son of God, a son of Abraham. The only thing that's different here in this story is that we see, and Jesus gives a because. He gives a because. He says that he's a son of Abraham. For you and me, this is like not common language. We don't really understand what son of Abraham is because we're not in a Jewish culture. But for a Jewish culture, they knew exactly what that meant. As a son of Abraham was someone that decided to believe in God. Because Abraham historically was someone who put his faith in God before Jesus was on the planet. And it said his faith credited to him as righteousness. In fact, Paul came along in Galatians as he was writing a letter to the Galatian church, and he wrote this to kind of clarify this whole idea for us about Abraham. He said, so also Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness, being right with God. Understand that those who have faith are children of Abraham, sons of Abraham. And it says Scripture foresaw that God would justify the Gentiles. In other words, he would make the Gentiles right with God. Gentiles being anyone, obviously, who's not an Israelite, by faith. And announced the gospel in advance to Abraham that all nations would be blessed through you. Now watch this last statement. So those who rely on faith are blessed along with Abraham, the man of faith. Those who rely on faith. So if we read between the lines a little bit in this story of Zacchaeus, Zacchaeus relied on faith alone because Jesus' response to him was to call him a son of Abraham. In that moment, his faith saved him, which is pretty awesome about who Jesus is and his ability to forgive all that we've done, that based on our faith, we're forgiven, we're made righteous in the sight of God. But Jesus, I believe in this moment, like he reveals a little bit about his character. And we can come in with all kinds of expectations, but he all of a sudden introduces a reality, a drop the microphone type of statement, that at the end of this interaction with that Zacchaeus, we see Jesus say something that really should shape the reality of how we view God. Almost as if to say, listen, hold up, let me give some clarity. For all who are listening, if you've been expecting a Messiah, or you have your expectations about who Jesus is supposed to be, let me just give some clarity. He says this as he wraps up this story with Zacchaeus, the Son of Man has come to seek and save the lost. For all the people that were listening in the crowd that day, hey, listen up. You might think the Messiah is here to do all this other stuff. He's come to seek and save the lost. He's come to seek and save the lost. That's what Jesus came to do. And I don't think that's what the crowd expected. In fact, I'm not sure if that's what we expect. We might have different expectations for Jesus. I mean, think about this. Maybe some of us have been here thinking that he was here for social reform, or he's for my good, or he's for my happiness, or he's here to teach us how to love. Maybe even you might have different expectations for church, like it's here just to make me better, or it's here to feed me so that I can grow, or it's here for my holiness training. Or maybe you've just been here today and your only expectation is just to have a good coffee. Or maybe your expectation is just to fulfill a religious obligation to come to church. So to Jesus, for all time and for all expectations that we might have about God, to bring clarity to our expectations, he says, expectations meet reality. The Son of Man has come to seek and save the lost. That's why I'm here. That's why I'm here. I think it's interesting because my expectations can shape my perspective of reality. But the truth is, reality doesn't change. It doesn't change. Reality is reality. And I got to come to grips with that. I need to respond to what is actually real as opposed to trying to shape it with my expectations. I can't say to a rock, you're not a rock. It just is. I can't expect to go through that wall and actually not get hurt because it's a wall. When you come in contact with reality, you have to respond to reality. When I look at and that's why I believe this statement. Here, let's put this on the screen. Jesus came to seek and save the lost. And our reaction as he did that as followers should model his behavior. Jesus came to seek and save the lost, and followers should model his behavior. Our reaction to that reality matters. Because Zacchaeus and the crowd, they both had expectations that day, and they both had reactions. Zacchaeus' reaction to reality was that he reacted with gladness and humility. But the crowd had an opposite response. Their expectations met reality, and they began to mutter and gossip. So I have to ask myself, what am I going to do with the reality that Jesus came to seek and save the lost? What do I do with that reality? Because if God was on the planet to seek and save the lost, then my reaction should be also to seek and save the lost. And if God's priority was to seek and save the lost, then my reaction should be also to prioritize seeking and saving the lost. Because Jesus said that the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your mind. And loving him requires me to act that way, to react that way. And I think when expectation meets reality, there's an adjustment period that needs to take place. And I have to decide how I'm going to react to reality. Am I going to embrace it or reject it? Am I going to adjust it or am I going to avoid it? Because the truth is, we can't hold on to our expectations once reality is in the room. We just can't. Let me give you a tangible story about this. So about 19 years ago, my wife and I got married right here on this stage. Some of you were here for that event. It was really fun. And so we were kind of traditional in that sense. We decided we weren't going to stay the night somewhere. We were actually going to get married and fly out and go on our honeymoon right away. And so as soon as we ate some cake and did a dance or two, we got into a limousine that we borrowed from CMTS, if you know where that is. It was an old rusty limousine that we drove to Philadelphia Airport and flew out to Las Vegas. So we were trying to go to Sedona, Arizona, but our landing spot was in Las Vegas. Here's my plan. I was planning on having one night at a timeshare just outside of Vegas. So my expectation was to get there and get a rental car and then drive out. Well, we left pretty late. By the time we landed, it was already 11 o'clock Vegas time, so it was really late. It was 3 hours. It was for us, it was 1:30 in the morning. I walked up to Hertz Rental Car, and I had prepared for this. I paid for it in advance. I was trying to be wise. And when I walked up to the rental car company, I said, I'll take my car now. And they looked at us and said, sure, you just got to pay for it. I was like, well, I already paid in advance. They're like, we didn't charge your credit card. Okay, take my credit card. Charge it. Let's go. So, I'm 25 years old, and they take my credit card. They go to charge it, and they say it's declined. I'm like, that's not great because I don't have any other backup resources in my pocket or anything like that. But I'm like, that can't be right. Just go ahead and charge it again. Declined. Now, part of the story here is that I was a 25-year-old idiot who didn't call the credit card company and tell them I was going on vacation. So I walked over to the ATM and thought to myself, that's okay, I'll get some cash. Well, I went to get cash out, and there was a $200 limit. All right, cool. I'll take it back to the car guys. I took it back to them. I was like, I can pay. I got cash. They were like, okay, that's fine. $300, please. I only have $200. And all of a sudden, expectations were running into reality where I couldn't rent a car. So my wife and I, who were very sheltered, and we basically had never even been out of Berks County or outside of the church walls. It felt like we went to to hail a cab, which we had never done before. And we go to hail a cab, and by this time, I'm already flustered. I'm carrying her 7 or 8 bags that are so large, through the airport into the cab. He puts them in his trunk, and he says, where are you going? I'm like, I don't know. I think it says Flamingo Bay. So he takes us to the biggest casino in Las Vegas. I'm not kidding. It was enormous. And we were driving down the strip of Las Vegas. It's coming alive because it's 12 a.m. in the morning. And I'm feeling to myself I can't even look outside because the billboards, I'm sorry, honey. And we get out and we go into this large casino, the Flamingo Bay. I drag all of our bags up to the desk and say, can we have our room, please? And they're like, we're sorry, you don't have a room here. I'm like, oh, it says Flamingo Bay. I'm like, I'm sorry. Okay, well, can we rent a room? Yeah, sure, of course. $1,000, please. And so then I was like, oh, just look at it. And they're like, well, your reservation is for the Westgate Flamingo Bay, which is 10 miles away from here. And so eventually we drug our bags out and we had to load them back in the cab and drive all the way out. It was like 3 a.m. before we finally got there. All that perspective to say, when expectation met reality, it wasn't what I expected. So we had to react. We had to change our perspective of reality based on what reality actually was. And it's going to happen for all of us. So how do we react when we run into reality? Many Israelites had an expectation of who Jesus was going to be, what the Messiah was going to be. And because they didn't react to reality, they missed out. A lot of them missed out on a relationship with God. And God might not be or do what you expect him to be, but we have to react to who he is. We got to adapt our perspective because he is. Just listen to a couple of these attributes about God. He is truth. He's eternal. He's love. He's perfect. He's just. He's kind. He's patient. He's forgiving. He's redeeming and restoring, to name a few. And if he came here to seek the lost, seek and save the lost, then he came here for the hurting. He came here for the broken. He came here for messy people, for addicts. He came here for murderers, for liars, for disobedient people. He came here for angry people. He came here for sinners. And honestly, I can't continue coming to church, calling myself a follower of Jesus while ignoring what is his priority. I have to react to the reality of who he is. Jesus came to seek and save the lost. And if I call myself a follower, I should model his behavior. I should model his behavior. So maybe like today, as you're wrestling with this idea, maybe you've distanced yourself from someone because you've thought to yourself, they're just too messy. They're too much of a sinner. I can't interact with them. And maybe you felt to yourself like just coming to church, that's just enough for me. That's all I'm supposed to do, just following in this religious rhetoric of being here. Maybe you're so far on the other side. Maybe you have always thought to yourself, I'm too far gone, and there's no hope for me to have a relationship with God. And maybe based on the story of Zacchaeus, you might have thought to yourself, I had no idea that God could care about me like that. But when expectation meets reality, we have to react. We have to adjust. How do we adjust when we realize that Jesus came to seek and save the lost? If I'm going to follow, I have to care about the lost as much as he does. I have to care. I have to prioritize my life around what matters most to Jesus, because that's what he's called me to be as a follower. Jesus, I just pray that this morning you would give us the insight and the strength and the knowledge to follow you. Because following in your footsteps doesn't always look like the popular direction. But when I think about the disciples, those 12 guys who followed you so closely, once you were off the planet, they decided to lay down their lives for this mission. And they followed you with all of their heart. Now, those disciples were torn apart and they were ripped in shreds because they wanted to continue the message. And as they passed the message, the good news of the kingdom, that message over time eventually came to us. And now it's our turn. It's our turn to lay down our lives and prioritize your mission about the kingdom above our own. And whether or not we've just been coming to church for what we expect church to be, I pray this morning that you would help reshape what our priorities should be in light of the reality that you've come to seek and save the lost. I need to adjust. God, I pray that this morning you give me the strength to do that. And God, for those people that are here today that are feeling like they didn't have a shot at a relationship with you, I pray that the encouragement of your interaction with Zacchaeus would bring hope. And God, for those of us that feel like we're just too messed up, I just pray that this morning we would realize that we're not too far. There's no far that's too far for you. That you chase after us and you care. Jesus, this morning I pray that we would come into contact with your reality and be astounded by the beautiful nature of who you are. Let us be in awe of you. And let us respond. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.